A museum guard asked Big Shaq to leave the VIP area, thinking it was just another case of protocol. But what followed wasn't outrage or confrontation. It was something far more powerful. With quiet resolve and unshakable presence, Big Shaq stayed exactly where he was, and in doing so, turned a moment of quiet exclusion into a national reckoning. No raised voice, no headlines chased, just a living legend, forcing a room built on justice to confront who truly gets to belong. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun filtered down like soft gold over the National Mall, casting long shadows across the pavement. Washington, D.C. pulsed with its usual hum, tourists moving in clusters, school buses unloading kids in matching shirts, couples stopping to snap photos in front of monuments that whispered stories of struggle and glory. Amid all the movement, one man walked alone, tall, deliberate, and almost too large for the sidewalk, yet somehow managing to disappear into the flow. Shaquille O'Neal, known to millions as Big Shaq, was dressed not in fanfare but in comfort. A dusty blue vintage Georgetown sweater, soft around the edges, and spotless white sneakers that barely made a sound as he moved. He didn't come here to be noticed. He wasn't here for a ribbon cutting, a press conference, or a charitable photo op. This was personal. It had been years since his last visit to the National Liberty Museum, tucked just a block away from the heavier foot traffic, its glass panels reflecting the city's quiet resilience. Shaq had chosen this day for a reason, not an anniversary, not a birthday, just the day he'd finally stopped making excuses to avoid it. Inside, the air was cool and silent, a quiet contrast to the city's noise outside. Families wandered between exhibits. A mother read aloud from a plaque about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to her young daughter. A teenage boy stood transfixed by a sculpture of Harriet Tubman, fingers pressed to the glass as if her bravery might seep through to him. Shaq moved through the museum, with a slow grace. He had always believed that silence held more weight than applause. He paused now in front of a wide exhibit on American justice, the type of display filled with faces carved in honor, names etched in timelines. Some he knew, others he didn't, but all of them reminded him why he was here. He glanced upward at a steel inscription welded above the gallery. "Freedom is not given, it is." His father had once repeated those exact words to him, on a night Shaq still couldn't shake. It was back in Newark. He must have been 12. Rain tapped the windows like a warning while his father paced the living room floor, furious after a run-in with a grocery store clerk who refused to cash his check until he'd shown 3 forms of ID. "Don't let the size of your body make you think you're too big to feel small," his father had said, jabbing a finger at him, eyes wild with pain. "There'll be days when you walk into a room and the world don't see you, just your shadow, so what you do in that moment, that's your name, that's your legacy." And now, here he was, 3 decades later, standing in a museum, built to honor legacies, his own name tucked quietly into the history books, but his soul still learning what that weight meant. As he moved toward a smaller wing marked the Hall of Justice, VIP access only, he didn't notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere, not at first. The quiet click of footsteps behind him, the slight narrowing of eyes from a guard stationed just past the velvet rope. He wasn't carrying a badge, wasn't dressed in a suit, wasn't flanked by security or handlers or photographers. In fact, he looked just like what he was today, a man trying not to be seen. But that didn't sit well with everyone. There was an art to blending in when you were 7'1". Shaq had perfected it over years of ducking through doorways and smiling politely at people who stared too long. Yet still, in spaces marked exclusive, VIP or authorized personnel, he could feel the weight of his name being both too much and not enough. He stepped past the rope, more out of absent-minded interest than defiance, and found himself in a quieter section of the gallery. Here, portraits hung larger, lighting dimmed slightly. An aura of reverence touched the walls. The air smelled of polished wood and whispered power. He took a slow breath and stared at the face of Bayard Rustin, the civil rights architect so often omitted from the headlines. Rustin's eyes held secrets, strategies, and a tired kind of truth that resonated in Shaq's chest. He stared at that portrait a long time, unmoving. And still he felt it, the shift in energy, the suspicion, the stillness of someone watching, not out of curiosity but out of doubt. He turned his head slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to catch the reflection in the polished glass. A guard, mid-30s, lean build, crew-cut blonde hair, A name tag. Brandon McCree. He wasn't saying anything. Not yet. But his eyes narrowed every time Shaq paused. Every time he read. Every time he looked comfortable. Shaq had seen that look before. In country clubs. In jewelry stores. In hotel lobbies. When he walked in before the valet knew who he was.
He could have spoken, could have introduced himself, could have rattled off his resume, the NBA rings, the doctorate degree, the law enforcement badge he still carried from his honorary deputy days. But he didn't.
He just kept walking. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still under scrutiny. The whispers began a few minutes later. A teenage couple nearby did a double take. A father turned to his son and whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" Phones began to lift subtly. A ripple moved through the gallery like a slow wave. And the guard? He grew tenser with each quiet realization. Shaq stopped again. This time in front of a small bronze sculpture of Thurgood Marshall. The quote beneath it read, "Where you see wrong or inequality, or injustice, speak out, because this is your country." He smiled. Irony, sharp and sweet. Because the moment was coming. He felt it in his bones. But not yet. Not here. Not before the quiet could settle one last time. He turned, finally, meeting the guard's eyes for the first time. Nothing aggressive. Nothing accusatory. Just that deep, slow nod Shaq had used 1,000 times before on the court, in interviews, when walking through neighborhoods where people didn't know what to make of his size or his silence. And in that single moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not peace, not understanding, but awareness, of power, of position, of who got to decide what belonged. Shaq turned back toward the portrait. One last breath. Then he stepped deeper into the exhibit. The story hadn't started yet, but the fuse had been lit. The moment Shaq stepped past the velvet rope into the VIP Hall of Justice, the atmosphere changed, not with a loud declaration, but like a note just slightly out of tune, enough to shift the entire melody. The hallway wasn't just quieter, it was curated silence. Deep carpet muffled every step, the lighting dimmed to a respectful amber glow, and classical jazz hummed low from unseen speakers. This wasn't a space for wandering, it was for reflection, or for the carefully invited. Shaq moved slowly, deliberately, his frame filling more space here than it had in the rest of the museum. But there was something in his walk that didn't impose. He wasn't there to dominate the room. He was absorbing it. Every portrait he passed pulled something out of him, memories, echoes, small voices from childhood that still spoke when the world grew too quiet. This wasn't a tour for him. It was a reckoning. His eyes paused on a painting that held him in place like gravity. Bayard Rustin. A soft palette of grays and blues, the texture so fine it almost shimmered. Rustin's gaze was calm but unyielding. The background behind him, a swirl of motion, protest signs, blurred faces, the chaos of change. Yet Rustin stood serene in the middle, still, black, gay, powerful in his silence. Shaq took a breath. He'd read about Rustin in college. But seeing him here, larger than life, brushed in oil and reverence, shook something loose. Shaq thought of the times he'd been told to soften his voice, to shift his posture, to smile more in interviews, so he didn't seem intimidating. The way people still flinched when he stepped onto elevators alone. He remembered the kid in the locker room who'd once asked, "Does it bother you looking like a threat?" He hadn't answered then, but he would now, just not with words. Unbeknownst to him, a small red light flicked on in a camera just above the exhibit's archway. Motion triggered. A live feed began to roll into the back office, where two museum employees, both seated behind a wall of monitors, leaned forward. "Hey," one said, pointing to the screen. "Is he supposed to be in there?" The other narrowed his eyes. "That's the restricted hall. Only guided visits. Board guests. Celebrities by appointment." "You think he's—" The screen flickered slightly, as Shaq leaned closer to the plaque below. Rustin's portrait. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," one said with certainty, but the tone wasn't celebratory, it was hesitant. But he didn't check in through the VIP list. In the museum's west corridor, Brandon McCree adjusted his utility belt and responded to the soft buzz in his earpiece. "Copy. I'm heading that way." Back in the exhibit, Shaq had no idea that assumptions had begun forming around him. He didn't feel the digital trail behind him, no check-in, no call ahead, no press alert. All he felt was a quiet that was starting to feel artificial. He moved on from Rustin, past a sculpture of John Lewis, its bronze arms raised as if mid-chant, to a digital display looping clips of Angela Davis at a university rally. Each piece struck a nerve. Each one reminded him why he'd chosen to come today, alone, without handlers. He needed to remember how it felt to not be protected by fame. Then came the moment. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A shuffle. A presence. Shaq turned slightly. Behind him, maybe 15 feet back, stood a tall man in a Navy security uniform, arms folded, eyes locked. The guard wasn't moving in yet, just watching. But it wasn't casual. It wasn't protocol. It was performance. Shaq knew this posture. He'd seen it from cops at routine traffic stops, from hotel clerks when his credit card hadn't swiped on the first try, from strangers in boardrooms, where he was the only black man in a tailored suit. It was a posture that didn't ask questions. It waited for mistakes. The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Shaq turned back toward the exhibit, acting as if he hadn't noticed. But now every painting felt like it was watching him. Every figure of justice, frozen in bronze and canvas, looked suddenly too still, too quiet, as if wondering how long before their stories were forgotten or rewritten. Behind him, Brandon McCree took a step forward. He didn't speak, not yet, just lingered a little closer. Just enough for Shaq to hear the soft shift of his boots against the carpet. Another visitor entered the hall from the main exhibit. A young couple 20s, matching denim jackets, holding hands. They slowed at the sight of Shaq, eyes widening slightly, nudging each other. The man raised his phone halfway, uncertain if he should take a picture. McCree caught it too. He hesitated, uncertain now. If this was Shaquille O'Neal, he had a situation. But if it wasn't, he needed to act. Either way, indecision buzzed in the air, like static. Shaq took another slow breath. He didn't move toward the door. He didn't offer explanation. He stood exactly where he was, hands behind his back, staring at a photograph of a civil rights march through Selma, his lips pressed tight. Behind him, the security guard finally cleared his throat. "Sir." Shaq didn't turn. He kept his gaze steady, waiting. A pause. "You can't be in this area without clearance." The words hung in the air. Not shouted, not aggressive, but lined with doubt. Lined with "you don't belong here." Shaq finally turned, calm and slow. His voice, when it came, was measured. "Is that right?" McCree's posture stiffened. He didn't respond immediately. The couple with the phone had stopped altogether now, pretending to read a plaque while clearly watching the exchange. Shaq didn't say his name, didn't flash an ID. He didn't need to. The room already knew. But he wasn't going to offer them the out. Not yet. McCree shifted slightly. "This section is reserved for scheduled tours or board guests." Shaq looked past him toward the entrance. No signs, no ropes, just space. "I see." That was all. No protest, no resistance. But the way he said it, that quiet agreement, made the guard hesitate. Before McCree could speak again, the young man from the couple whispered to his partner, then, a beat later, stepped forward. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, addressing McCree, "but that's Shaquille O'Neal." Shaq closed his eyes for a second, then opened them slowly. Brandon blinked. "Shaq," the young woman added, smiling nervously, "you're like a legend." McCree exhaled, the moment tilting. But he didn't apologize. He just stepped back slightly, hands resting now on his belt, no longer on alert, but not fully at ease either. Shaq turned to face the portraits once more, the tension not diffused, just displaced. Because while the confrontation had stopped, the judgment hadn't. The room, once filled with the echoes of justice, now buzzed with the silent weight of assumption. And somewhere deep in the heart of the museum, a curator watching the live security feed pressed pause and leaned forward. The real story, she realized, had just begun. Brandon McCree approached like a man trying to act normal, while battling the deep unease of uncertainty. His uniform was crisp, museum-issued navy, with a badge too new to have scratches, and shoes that squeaked faintly with every step. His hand stayed near his hip, not on a weapon, but on the two-way radio clipped to his belt. His jaw worked once before he spoke. "Sir," he said again, this time louder, with a tighter throat. "This section is restricted access. I'm going to have to ask you to return to the public exhibit area." Shaq stood before a plaque on Bayard Rustin's life, his hands still loosely behind his back. He didn't look at Brandon. He read the last line on the display aloud, under his breath. "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the moment. Brandon took a half step closer. "Sir, I'm talking to you." Shaq finally turned. Not fast, not challenging, just enough for eye contact. He gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged both the voice and the absurdity of the moment. A polite nod, almost apologetic, but it didn't come with retreat. "I hear you," he said simply, his voice a low baritone, calm and unshaken. Brandon stood straighter, caught off guard by the size of the man before him, but more so by his tone, gentle, unreadable, not defensive, not afraid, just present. For a beat, Brandon hesitated, unsure how to respond to someone who wasn't giving him resistance, but also wasn't complying. Shaq turned back toward the artwork. "Are you with a tour?" Brandon asked, sharper now. "Nope. This is for approved guests only." "I figured. Then you'll need to come with me." Shaq didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash credentials or declare who he was. That wasn't the game he played. He'd learned long ago that making people see him wasn't about reminding them of who he was. It was about watching how they acted when they thought they didn't have to respect you. He smiled, faint and dry. "Beautiful exhibit. Powerful stuff." Brandon exhaled through his nose, a flash of frustration passing over his features. This wasn't going how he'd expected. Something about the stillness of this man, the way he took up space without apologizing, unnerved him. From a balcony, above the hall, Elise Morrow, the museum's deputy director of programs and exhibits, stood motionless behind a pane of tinted glass. She'd seen it all unfold. Shaq's entrance, the subtle body language of Brandon, the shift in the gallery's energy. Elise wasn't a stranger to racial dynamics in cultural spaces. She'd spent her career trying to expand inclusion in institutions that were built, ironically, to honor those who were once excluded. And now she was watching a moment she'd always feared, that uncomfortable convergence between public authority and private prejudice. She didn't move yet. She wanted to believe it would settle, that the guard would recognize Shaquille O'Neal, and step back with humility. But the longer she waited, the more the scene tensed. Back on the floor, Brandon's voice firmed. "Sir, if you're not part of a scheduled group, I'm going to need to escort you out of this section." Shaq turned to him again, this time more fully. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Less amusement, more resolve. "Is that what this is?" he asked. "An escort?" Brandon blinked. "It's protocol." "You enforce protocol on every visitor like this?" Shaq asked, his tone still low, but carrying weight now. "Or just the ones who don't look like they belong?" That stopped Brandon cold. A thin line of red crept up his neck. He didn't answer right away, because he didn't know how to. Not honestly. The rulebook said the VIP hall was limited to scheduled groups. The rulebook didn't explain how to handle exceptions, especially ones whose presence made you question why the rule existed in the first place. "I'm doing my job," Brandon muttered, but the conviction had softened. Shaq nodded slowly. "I know. It's the part that always stings the most." From the second floor, Elise exhaled and stepped away from the glass. Her fingers hovered over the intercom before pulling back. This was her moment to step in, to de-escalate, but a voice in her mind, older male institutional, echoed back, "Keep the VIP hall controlled. No exceptions." If she interrupted now, she'd be called emotional, overstepping, political. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator. Back in the hall, a few more visitors had stopped pretending to browse. A woman in a pantsuit stood frozen beside a display about the Freedom Riders. A boy in a baseball cap peeked around a corner. Eyes watched, not just out of curiosity now, but calculation. Something was happening and everyone sensed it, though no one knew how it would end. Brandon was aware of them too. He adjusted his stance. "Look, sir, if you could just step back to the main gallery, we can sort this out without making a scene." Shaq raised a brow. "Scene?" Brandon flushed. "I didn't mean—" "But here we are," Shaq interrupted gently. "Already in one." He looked around the hall. His voice didn't rise, but somehow filled the space. "I came here today because I wanted to feel something, to remember something. I've spent my whole life being looked at, judged, labeled. I thought maybe, just maybe, in a room built to honor justice, I could exist without proving my right to be here." Brandon shifted his weight, uncertain now. Shaq let the silence hang before continuing. "I didn't walk in here to be difficult. I didn't step past that rope to challenge anyone. I walked in because I saw a face I recognized on that wall. Not just Rustin's, but the others. The ones who kept standing, even when people told them to move. He turned back toward Brandon. I'm not offended by you, he said softly. I'm used to you. And that somehow was more devastating than any shout. More indicting than any accusation. Elise entered the gallery then, heels quiet against the carpet, her face calm but determined. She moved with quiet authority, threading through the tension like it had a physical form. Brandon, she said, her voice clear. It's okay. He turned to her, caught between obedience and confusion. He's allowed, she added, eyes not leaving Shaq. Brandon nodded once, stepped back. He didn't apologize. He couldn't, not when he still didn't know how to articulate what had just happened. Shaq gave Elise a small nod of thanks, then returned his gaze to the portraits. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It lingered in the air, in the eyes of the onlookers, in the quiet crackle that still hadn't faded from the room. The confrontation had ended. But the question it raised, who gets to belong and who gets asked to prove it, remained suspended in the space between justice and perception. And Shaq, unmoved, stood at the center of it all. Not enraged, not broken, but as steady as the legacy that led him there. The questions began to multiply, not shouted, not confrontational, but present. The kind of crowd curiosity that simmers before it erupts. It was the kind of pressure that builds without visible heat, until suddenly no one remembers how it started. In the second-floor security viewing room, a young intern named Miles Carr leaned closer to the monitor. His eyes were locked onto the scene unfolding in real time. They're not de-escalating, he muttered to himself. They're tightening it. Beside him, Janelle Avery, one of the museum's PR assistants, hovered with her hand over her phone. Should we call legal? She asked. Or Elise? But Elise Morrow was already on the move. She stood just beyond the archway to the Hall of Justice, hidden in a thin shadow between two large columns. Her heels were quiet now, shoes slipped off in a practiced gesture from years of museum work. She'd seen enough high-stakes moments unfold inside galleries to know sometimes sound was your enemy. From where she stood, Elise had a perfect view. She could see Brandon, rigid and flustered. She could see the growing crowd, their expressions shifting from passive curiosity to engaged scrutiny. She could see Shaq, his restraint becoming a spotlight, and she could feel the decision rising inside her. But she didn't move forward yet. She waited. Why? Because Elise Morrow had learned something very particular about power in places like this. Step in too early, and you erase the moment's potential. Step in too late, and you inherit the blame. But time it just right, and you change the narrative forever. And so she waited. Back on the floor, the tension was tangible now. Shaq looked not at Brandon, but at the crowd around them, at the children, the students, the everyday visitors who now held phones, like shields and lenses of justice. The moment wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to every person watching. And that, more than any argument or title drop, was what gave it power. A woman in her 50s took a few steps forward. Excuse me, she said, her voice controlled, southern accented. Why is he being asked to leave? Brandon didn't answer. He was staring at the cameras now, realizing how many eyes were recording. Shaq, calm as ever, turned to her and gave a soft shrug. Guess I look out of place. The line hit like a wave. A ripple moved through the crowd. Laughter, not amused, but bitter, escaped from the college kid in the Howard hoodie. Man, in a justice hall. That was the tipping point. Another visitor began filming openly now. A low murmur of voices, layered over each other, some whispering Shaq's name, others asking why there were no signs about access restrictions, others still wondering why the security guard hadn't backed off the second he knew who he was dealing with. Brandon looked to Elise, silently pleading now, but still unable to admit fault. His hands twitched at his sides. That was when Elise stepped out from the column's shadow. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Mr. O'Neill, she said with practiced warmth. We're honored to have you here. The sound of her heels rejoining the floor was the final punctuation. A dozen heads turned as she approached, her presence immediately reframing the scene. Brandon stepped back, unsure if he should salute or disappear. The crowd's attention pivoted toward her. I apologize, she said, directly to Shaq. There seems to have been some confusion. Shaq met her eyes, nodded once, then turned back to the exhibit, allowing her to stand beside him rather than in front. No harm, he said, but maybe some lesson. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Elise gave a tight nod, then turned to the crowd. This section is in development and was not yet open to the public, but we're making adjustments. Thank you all for your patience. It was a practiced line, one that gave everyone a way out, a story that could be told without naming what had actually happened. But the crowd knew. They didn't cheer, they didn't applaud, but the energy shifted from suspicion to solidarity. Some phones went down, others kept rolling. Either way, the moment had landed. Shaq turned once more to the portrait of Bayard Rustin. The echoes in the room were no longer whispers of judgment. They were reverberations of awareness. A boy in the back whispered, "That's what a giant looks like." And no one disagreed. Shaq stood before the painting, Bayard Rustin, the room gently glowing in the amber tones of its museum lighting. He let the silence linger, not for drama, but because what he was about to say wasn't calculated. It wasn't defense. It wasn't defiance. It was memory, one that had clung to the back of his throat for years, only now surfacing with the full gravity of what had just unfolded. He turned slightly, not to address anyone in particular, but enough that his voice carried across the gallery. "You know," he began, voice calm, low, a little husky, "the first museum I ever went to was in Newark." Heads tilted. Some leaned in. Phones, though still up, weren't moving now. The moment had shifted from viral spectacle to something more intimate. I must have been 8. My mama took me and my cousin Marcus on the city bus, dropped off right at the corner. The place wasn't fancy, no marble floors or gold-plated donors on the walls, just linoleum tiles and pictures of people we never learned about in school. He smiled faintly, eyes focused somewhere far beyond the present. She held my hand tight when we walked in. I remember that. She always did when we were somewhere new. Somewhere where eyes followed us longer than they should have. A few people in the crowd stirred, uncomfortable not because of what he said, but because of how honest it was. There was a woman at the front desk, older, white, short gray hair. Asked my mama if she was with the school tour. My mama smiled, that smile she used when she was swallowing something nasty, and said no, just bringing her boy to see his history. The way Shaq said her boy with a pause, with a reverence, carried an emotional texture even words couldn't fully deliver. She asked if there was a fee. The lady said, "Only for non-school groups." Mama reached for her purse, but the lady waved her off. Said it was fine. But the way she said it, he trailed off, letting the implication fill the room. Mama didn't like pity or charity. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned houses, ran laundry at the hospital, woke up before sunrise, came home after dinner, hands smelling like bleach and burnt linen, but she paid anyway. A $5 bill she could have used for the bus ride back. He turned to look directly at the crowd now, his voice steady, but the edges softened with reflection. I didn't understand it then. I thought she was being proud. Thought maybe she just didn't want to feel small. But later that night, when she was folding laundry on the couch, I heard her crying. Not loud, not broken, just quiet. He paused, then added, "That's the kind of crying that stays with you." The crowd had stopped shifting now. No shuffling feet, no side conversations. Even the security staff along the walls stood frozen, unsure whether they were guards or witnesses anymore. "She told me that night," Shaq continued, "people gonna look at you 2 ways your whole life, son. Big or black. And both of those things can scare the wrong people if you don't know how to carry them." He looked down for a moment, almost like he was reliving her voice. "But you carry them with grace," she said. "You make 'em feel peace when they look at you, not fear. You hear me?" He nodded slowly, as if answering her still. "That's when I made a promise, not to stay silent, when I saw that look she got in that museum. That quiet judgment. That fake smile. I promised I wouldn't walk past it." He turned to face the Rustin portrait again, his voice dropping just enough to draw people closer in. "Some people think justice is loud. A fight. A courtroom speech. A protest chant. And yeah, it's all that too. But sometimes it's a kid watching his mama get looked at like she's an outsider in a place made to honor her struggle, and deciding right then and there he's never gonna let someone tell her she doesn't belong again." Lise Morrow, standing off to the side, felt her throat tighten. She'd spent her career curating exhibitions like this one, assembling the names and images of those who'd fought and suffered for dignity. But rarely had she stood in the presence of someone who embodied that legacy in real time. She felt the story rise in her chest, the weight of its truth making her question how many people walked through her museum every day, feeling like they were being tolerated instead of welcomed. Shaq stepped closer to the center of the exhibit now, not for drama but because he needed to move. The weight of the past was pressing against his ribs. I don't need recognition, don't need plaques, don't need apologies. I've got more trophies than I got shelves. But what I do need, what we all need, is to walk into a room built to honor justice and not feel like we're being judged. He looked toward Brandon, who stood off to the side now, eyes low, his earlier posture folded in on itself. I get it. You got rules. I've had rules thrown at me my whole life. In airports, at hotels, on golf courses. Rules are easy. But justice? Shaq paused. Justice is hard. Justice is when you stop following a rule, because it's comfortable, and start asking why it was written in the first place. A murmur of agreement rolled through the gallery, not loud but firm. People weren't just bystanders now, they were invested. Shaq nodded once, then added, I'm not mad at you, man. I'm disappointed. Not because of what you said, but because you looked at me and saw a problem instead of a person. Brandon didn't speak. He couldn't. The room wouldn't let him. Shaq turned to the rest of the crowd. My mama taught me something else that day, he said, eyes scanning the room slowly. She said, you don't change people's hearts by shouting at them. You change them by staying in the room. He looked back at the painting of Bayard Rustin. So I stayed. And with that he walked to the far end of the exhibit. Away from the spotlight, away from the stairs, pausing only once to read another plaque. This one on Ella Baker. Behind him the crowd remained still, as if the floor itself had absorbed something sacred. The moment wasn't explosive, it wasn't cinematic. It was quieter than that. More honest. Like the kind of memory that doesn't fade. The kind carved not in marble, but in you. She hadn't moved. Not because she didn't care, but because the moment had turned molten. Too hot, too fluid, and Elise, for all her titles and curated public poise, was caught in a kind of paralysis that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with history. Her history, the museums, the board, and the messy collision of all three. She could still hear the echo of Shaq's voice from minutes ago. Quiet, precise, each word he spoke carving itself into the silence like a truth no one could edit. He had not raised his voice. He had not played to the crowd. And that perhaps made the moment even more dangerous. Because it wasn't about outrage. It was about clarity. A man calmly refusing to diminish himself. And Elise had watched from the shadows. The memory of her last meeting with the board crackled at the edge of her conscience. It was just last week. Conference room B. Croissants too dry, coffee too cold, and the same power dynamics she'd battled since taking the role of deputy director 3 years ago. A donor from Connecticut, someone who didn't know James Baldwin from James Brown, had warned, we're seeing a lot of activism lately in cultural spaces. Be careful what kind of attention we attract. Keep the VIP hall pristine. Pristine. That word now rang like a threat. Because pristine hadn't meant clean. It had meant controlled, untouched, unprovoked. It had meant free from complication. And Shaquille O'Neal, simply by existing in that space without permission, had disrupted the illusion that access and dignity were one and the same. Elise slid down the wall slightly, arms crossed, and let her mind drift back farther. Years ago, her first real job at a gallery in St. Louis. She'd been 27, idealistic, still believing that intention could overpower bias. She remembered how often she'd been interrupted in meetings, how ideas were often heard only after a man rephrased them. She remembered one afternoon vividly, suggesting an exhibit on unsung women of color in labor movements, and the director had laughed and said, let's not get political, Elise. We're here for art, not agenda. She hadn't laughed, but she hadn't pushed either. And now, here she was, the deputy director of one of the most respected institutions in D.C., with a hall dedicated to justice and a security guard who had nearly escorted Shaquille O'Neal out of it for standing in the wrong spot with the wrong skin. She closed her eyes, breathed in, counted to 4. It was an old tactic, one she'd used before board reviews, before fundraising dinners, before entering rooms where she had to smile while absorbing backhanded praise like, you're exactly the kind of hire we needed to show progress. Progress. Another word that stung. Out in the gallery, the crowd was shifting again. She heard footsteps, a few camera clicks, the kind of shuffling that suggested people weren't sure if the moment had passed or was still unfolding. Elise knew the media would get wind of it. They always did. It would start small. maybe a tweet, a photo, a blog post. But the story would be shaped not by what actually happened, but by how the museum chose to respond. And that responsibility, in all its mess and weight, was crawling straight into Elise's chest. She looked down at her phone. 2 missed calls from Arnold Partridge, the executive director. She didn't need to check voicemail. She already knew the message. Control the narrative. Get ahead of the optics. Avoid liability. Make it go away. But she also remembered the look on Shaq's face when he said, "I'm used to you." That wasn't directed at Brandon McCree. That was for all of them. For every structure that had ever dressed itself in virtue while quietly reinforcing the divide. Elise turned toward the hallway mirror. Her reflection stared back, sharp lines under her eyes, a flush of tension rising in her cheekbones. She didn't look like a leader. She looked like a woman trying to calculate how much of herself she was willing to lose to keep the peace. And then came the voice she hadn't expected. "Ms. Morrow?" She turned. Miles Carr, the intern from Digital Archives, stood just a few feet away, awkward in his stance, but clearly agitated. His face was pale, his phone still open in his hand. "You should see this," he said, walking over. He showed her the screen, a tweet from someone inside the gallery. A blurry photo of Shaq standing by the Bayard Rustin portrait. Brandon McCree nearby, tense and red-faced. The caption read, "Shaq gets racially profiled in a museum honoring civil rights heroes. You can't make this up." The post already had 15,000 likes. Retweets piling up like a flood. Elise's stomach knotted. Another notification popped up beneath it. This one from a journalist she recognized. Then another. The museum's handle had been tagged. Over and over again. This wasn't speculative anymore. It was a story. Miles looked up. "Do we have a statement?" Elise didn't answer. Because in that moment, she knew this wasn't about a statement. It was about a stance. About whether she was going to wait for permission to do the right thing, or claim the risk, and take responsibility herself. She looked back toward the VIP hall. She could see Shaq again now, speaking quietly to a young man in a wheelchair. His hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder, and both of them were looking at a display titled "Legacy Through Action." A quote beneath the glass read, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Elise stepped into the light. Her heels clicked now, not quietly, not cautiously, but with intention. Her spine lengthened, chin lifted, and whatever hesitation had haunted her in the hallway was burning away with every step she took. She passed Brandon without looking at him. His mouth opened, but he said nothing. She moved to Shaq's side, waited until the boy stepped away, and then faced him squarely. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, and her voice didn't tremble. "We failed you today." The gallery hushed again. She let that sentence sit. Shaq turned toward her slowly, expression unreadable. "I could tell you it was a mistake," Elise continued, "that it wasn't personal, that it was policy. But that's not enough. Not here. Not in this space." There was a flutter in the crowd, a shift in posture, a breath being collectively held. "I watched it happen," she said, "and I didn't act when I should have. Because I've been trained to preserve the room before protecting the people inside it. And that's not the kind of leadership I want to be part of." Shaq studied her face.
"And what kind is that?" he asked.
Elise took a breath. "The kind where justice isn't just history on the wall. It's practice. And that means honoring people in the moment they stand in front of us, not just when they're gone and painted in gold." He nodded. "One." She turned to the crowd. "This exhibit is meant to reflect who we are. All of us. And if that reflection becomes distorted by who we let feel unwelcome in it, then we're not preserving history. We're betraying it." A pause. A shift. Applause didn't come. Not right away. But acknowledgement did. A ripple of approval in the form of breath, nods, softened shoulders. Shaq extended his hand. She took it. In that single gesture, Elise crossed the threshold she'd hovered behind her entire career. Not from failure to redemption, but from silence to truth. A truth carved not in stone, but in the actions that defined the spaces she'd helped build. And in that space, for the first time that day, the Hall of Justice finally lived up to its name. It started with a single tweet. 14 words. No punctuation. No hashtags. Just raw disbelief sent out into the digital void. Did this museum just try to kick out Shaq? The photo attached wasn't sharp. Taken hastily from behind a sculpture, slightly blurred with Shaquille O'Neal's unmistakable silhouette centered beneath the portrait of Bayard Rustin. Beside him, the security guard stood stiff, mid-gesture. The framing was accidental art, tension captured in pixels, and within minutes it exploded. At first it was a slow burn. Retweets, then quote tweets. People weren't sure what they were seeing. Context was limited. But outrage was instinctive. Some assumed it was a prank. Others thought it was satire. But the combination of Shaq, a civil rights museum, and the phrase kicked out, triggered something collective. An itch, an unease, a readiness to call out yet another system that looked polished on the surface, but fractured underneath. Within an hour, the post was on fire. Shaq being profiled in a museum about justice is too ironic to be fiction. Can't wait for the We Support Diversity press release and imagine standing next to Rosa Parks' statue while asking a black man to leave. But while the digital world spiraled, inside the museum, Shaq hadn't moved. He was now seated on a smooth wooden bench in the Hall of Justice. Legs stretched slightly, hands resting between his knees. His head was tilted up toward a high glass ceiling, the midday sun spilling fractured beams across his face. Around him, the crowd had partially dispersed. Some trickled out to update their friends. Others lingered like satellites, unsure whether they were still caught in the pull of something sacred. Shaq didn't check his phone. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift. He had lived long enough, carried enough public scrutiny, to know when a moment had jumped from his to theirs. Miles' car had stayed behind. He wasn't supposed to be in this section of the museum. He wasn't even supposed to be on break yet. But when he saw the commotion from the monitor feed, then recognized the figure on screen, he hadn't hesitated. He grabbed his tablet, ducked out of the media office, and followed the path to the VIP exhibit, with his heart thudding in his throat. Now tucked quietly in the archway just outside the hall, he was texting, not just scrolling, not doom scrolling, curating, documenting, acting. Yo, need to talk, he typed to his friend Jaya Rooker, a junior reporter at The Guardian US, someone always chasing real stories before they were spun by publicists. Her reply was almost instant.
I saw the post. I'm 2 stops away. Please tell me this isn't some brand stunt.
It's not, he replied. I'm inside. It's real. And it's bigger than you think. Miles wasn't just watching the moment unfold. He was watching the machine awaken. A machine he'd studied in college. One he'd blogged about, tweeted into, written think pieces to dissect, the whisper network, that subtle digital underground current of voices that rose before official stories were released, where truths were seeded, where accountability didn't need a press conference to begin. In this moment, was fertile. As he looked across the room at Shaq, still contemplative, silent, Miles was struck by the contrast. The man at the center of the storm looked like peace, like someone waiting, not for permission, but for the rest of the world to catch up to the truth he already knew. Outside the museum, people began arriving, not as protesters at least, not yet, but as observers. Word of mouth had beat the official channels, locals, tourists, students, from Howard and Georgetown, a few podcasters with small followings, even a pair of YouTubers who'd been filming at the Smithsonian and rerouted in real time. They weren't looking for a riot, they were looking for the why. Inside, Brandon McCree was no longer on the floor. Elise had quietly asked him to step into the administrative wing. It wasn't punishment yet, but it was necessary. Too many eyes, too much scrutiny. His absence only deepened the museum's silence. Meanwhile, Miles moved from the archway to the edge of the bench beside Shaq. He didn't sit, just stood, respectfully, then cleared his throat.
Mr. O'Neill!
Shaq turned, the movement slow, eyes warm but slightly tired. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, Miles said, his voice soft, for what happened, for how it started, for how long it's taken people like me to speak up. Shaq studied him for a moment, then offered a slow nod. You work here, he asked. Miles nodded. Digital media intern. Mostly behind the scenes. Not today. Miles let out a breath that was half relief, half weight. I told a reporter, not in a messy way, just told the truth. Shaq looked back toward the ceiling. Truth has a way of echoing, he said. Even when whispered. That sentence would later become the title of a viral essay. But in the moment it was just a quiet exchange between a legend and a listener. Across the city, the museum's public relations team was scrambling. The communications director, Nolan Jeffries, sat in a cafe near DuPont Circle when the tweet reached him. His phone buzzed for 6 minutes straight. First alerts, then calls, then screenshots. By the time he was halfway back to his office, Elise had already left him 3 voicemails, each one more composed than the last. Back inside, Jaya Rooker arrived. She didn't announce herself, didn't pull out a camera. She found Miles near the central atrium, nodded once, and he led her to the glass window that overlooked the Hall of Justice. "Holy," she whispered. Shaq was still there, still seated, still unmoved. Jaya raised her phone, not to record but to scroll. "CNN's sniffing it," she said. "Diet's already asked for comment. And someone's spinning it into a cancel culture debate, of course." Miles sighed. "How long before the museum drafts a statement that says nothing?" Jaya didn't answer. Because the truth was, statements didn't work the way they used to. Not in moments like this. Not when the crowd had already started documenting the museum's reaction, or lack thereof. Downstairs, a mother with 2 kids in matching red t-shirts approached Shaq slowly. "Can we sit?" she asked quietly. Shaq nodded. She and her boys sat beside him, the older one resting his hands on his knees, eyes wide. No one spoke for a while. They just looked around, at the murals, at the faces of people who'd marched, sung, prayed, and refused to move from counters and buses. Eventually, the younger boy asked, "Why were they mad at you?" Shaq looked at him, the question cutting deeper than any press coverage. "They weren't mad," he said. "They were unsure of what they saw." "Why?" "Because sometimes people see you and think about what they fear instead of what they know." The boy nodded slowly, as if cataloging that answer for later. And in that moment, miles beyond museum walls, phones buzzed with fresh updates, blogs posted summaries, TikTok creators began analyzing body language from the leaked footage, influencers reposted quotes, and beneath it all, the truth kept moving. Shared in screenshots reposted with captions, whispered in DMs, then shouted in stories. The Whisper network had become a storm, and still at the heart of it Shaq sat unbothered, unswayed and unflinchingly rooted in his presence. Because some truths don't need to be screamed. They only need to be seen. Elise Morrow stood at the edge of the Hall of Justice, her hand gripping a slim access badge, heart ticking louder than the conversation swirling behind her. Shaq was still seated on the bench, sunlight now cutting sharper lines across the polished floor. The quiet hadn't left the room. It had evolved. Respect replaced curiosity. But tension, the unspoken kind, still lingered under the surface, and she couldn't leave it there, not unfinished. She stepped forward, her heels soft against the carpet, and when she reached him she didn't interrupt. She waited until his gaze lifted to meet hers, steady and unreadable. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, voice low, "would you come with me for a moment?" He studied her, not coldly, but carefully. His silence wasn't resistance, it was evaluation. She didn't offer an explanation, didn't layer her request in rehearsed PR tones, just stood still, offering nothing but sincerity. Shaq rose slowly, and the shift in the room was immediate. A few visitors turned their heads, a photographer lowered his lens. Elise nodded to Miles, who gently redirected the path of the onlookers, subtly shielding Shaq from further camera eyes. She guided him through a narrow passage behind the exhibit's central wall, a door marked staff only, that clicked open with her badge. Beyond it, the temperature dropped, the lighting dimmed. They moved through a narrow hallway lined with archival crates, stacks of framed portraits covered in soft cloth, and shelves of old blueprints. The further they walked, the quieter it became, until even their footsteps lost rhythm. At the end of the corridor was another door, steel, clean and untouched. A keypad blinked red until Elise tapped a 6-digit code. It turned green. The door hissed slightly as it opened. Inside was the locked wing. Shaq stepped in first. It was a room like no other in the museum, unfinished but glowing with intent. A long curved wall of matte white, waiting for curation. Half the room was dark, corners hidden under plastic covers, but one section stood open. 7 portraits already mounted, spaced evenly, lit with soft golden spots from above. "This isn't open to the public yet," Elise said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "It's not even finished. The board didn't want to approve the unveiling until after the fiscal meeting next quarter." Shaq stepped closer to the wall. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't have to. The title etched into glass at the top answered everything. Legacy in Silence, Unsung Architects of Justice. Elise moved beside him, more composed now, though her chest still carried the burden of earlier silence. "These are the ones who weren't headline names. she explained. Not forgotten, but buried. Strategists, organizers, teachers, midwives, mentors, people who never made the textbooks but kept the movement moving. Shaq stopped in front of one of the portraits. A black man in his 60s. No smile, just eyes like stone and depth. Leroy Manfield, Elise said softly. He coordinated voter registration across 3 counties in Alabama for 20 years. Died before anyone recognized it. Shaq nodded, hands behind his back again. The pose automatic, respectful. I've been working on this project for over a year, Elise continued. Gathering names, vetting stories, finding the ones who didn't get medals or parades but changed everything anyway. She moved ahead of him and paused near the last portrait on the far end of the wall. It was covered in cloth. She hesitated. Shaq watched her. The reason I didn't speak up earlier, she said finally, wasn't just fear. It was this room. This project. It was on the edge. The board's been nervous. Donors asking questions. There's always politics behind which stories we choose to tell. She swallowed. And I thought if I just waited, if I just held on, I could protect this space. Shaq didn't answer. Not yet. Elise turned to the cloth-covered portrait. 2 weeks ago, the board added another name, she said. I didn't know until I saw the internal memo. They didn't announce it publicly, said they wanted to control the timing. But I think after today you deserve to see it now. Her fingers pulled the cloth down gently. Behind it, a portrait, oil on canvas. Unmistakable. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal. Not in uniform, not holding a ball, but seated in a simple wooden chair, wearing a navy jacket, an open collar shirt. His face was calm, reflective, one hand resting over his heart. The background was soft, faded. Images of community centers, children, books and quiet crowds layered behind him like ghostly echoes. Shaq didn't move. The image hung in silence between them. I didn't approve this, Elise added quickly, as if anticipating the reaction. But I didn't fight it either. I should have told you. Should have stepped up today. But I let fear dictate my moment. Shaq stepped forward, 1 foot, then another. He stood in front of the painting, taller than it, looking down slightly. The silence was thick. Finally, he said, "You know what the hardest part of legacy is?" Elise looked up, knowing you didn't ask for it. That it's built from things you never wanted to go through. And once people give it to you, they forget the pain behind it. They just want the symbol. Elise breathed in slowly. You're not a symbol to me. Shaq turned his head. Aren't I? A pause. Then she said, maybe I was afraid of what it meant if you stopped being one. The honesty landed with force. Shaq looked back at the portrait. I'm honored, he said simply. But I don't want to be in this room alone. Elise frowned. What do you mean? He pointed to the far wall, still bare, unfinished. There are names you haven't added yet. People I've met, stories I know. Not famous, not recognized, but they built me. And they belong here too. She stepped beside him, following his gaze. I want to help finish this, Shaq said. Elise looked at him, unsure if she was hearing an offer or a challenge. Then he added, justice isn't complete when it's curated. It's complete when it includes what's inconvenient. The words sank deep, not just into her, but into the room itself, into the future of what this space would become. And in that locked wing, with no audience, no cameras, no press, just truth, they stood in the quiet recognition of what legacy really demanded. Not perfection, but presence. By the time Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the museum's glass front doors and into the daylight, the entire block had shifted into a stage. What had started as whispers online had now become an undeniable public moment. News vans flanked the curb in a crooked line of urgency, cables trailing across the pavement, cameras mounted, logos stamped on windshields. Reporters stood poised in front of their crews, pressing earpieces and rehearsing taglines. Tourists who had stumbled into the middle of history stood shoulder to shoulder with activists holding cell phones. Protest signs hadn't arrived, but something just as potent had anticipation. Elise Morrow lingered just behind the tinted glass entrance, watching it unfold from within. Her blazer was wrinkled, her face drawn, but her posture was upright. The PR team had begged her to go back upstairs, to let Nolan Jeffries, the head of communications, handle the narrative, but she'd refused. She knew this wasn't their moment to manage. It was his, and Shaq knew it too. He didn't stride out like a man with something to prove. He didn't carry the heat of vengeance or the swell of showmanship. He walked with the slow, grounded presence of someone who had already lived through too many explanations, too many performances, and had finally decided silence didn't mean surrender. It meant preparation. As he emerged, voices rose like wind catching a sail. Microphones extended. Recorders clicked to life. Reporters called his name, some frantic, some rehearsed, all eager to grab the quote that would travel fastest. Mr. O'Neill, do you believe the museum was racially profiling you? Do you plan to take legal action? Is this another example of systemic bias in American institutions? Shaq held up one hand. The motion was gentle, deliberate, but the noise dimmed almost instantly. He stopped at the foot of the steps, just beyond the museum's sleek awning. The marble behind him gleamed in the sunlight. In front of him, lights, lenses, and dozens of eyes. He didn't step onto a podium. He didn't take a prepared statement. He stood on level ground, and he began. I want to thank everyone who's shown up today, he said. The ones asking questions, the ones just watching, the ones filming, tweeting, calling, sharing. I appreciate that. Truly. His voice carried, not because it was loud, but because it was weighted. Each word, paced like a heartbeat. I know why you're here. I know what the headline looks like. And I know what some of you are hoping I'll say. A small breeze passed through the crowd, rustling jackets and clipboards. A producer behind a camera signaled her crew to zoom in. But I'm not here to name names, Shaq continued. And I'm not here to add fuel to outrage. Some reporters shifted. Pencils paused. This wasn't the soundbite they expected. I'm here because something happened inside that museum that doesn't need a villain to be true, he said. I walked into a space meant to honor justice, and felt the same discomfort I felt in boardrooms, airports, restaurants, and yes, locker room. He glanced up, scanning the skyline for a breath. Then, looking directly into the camera nearest him, he said, I wasn't angry. I was patient. Because when you've lived long enough being misread, you stop reacting to the misunderstanding and start observing it. He took a step forward. One. No platform. No barriers. I watched. I waited. I let people show themselves. And they did. Some with judgment. Some with kindness. And one woman, Elise Morrow, chose to do the hardest thing a person in power can do. Admit she waited too long. Inside the museum, Elise's hand gripped the edge of the wall. Her eyes locked on the screen in the security lobby. She didn't blink. She could have stayed hidden. Shaq continued. She could have protected the image of the institution. But she chose something else, accountability. And for that I respect her. There was no applause, no cheering. The crowd wasn't an audience. It was a mirror. And what they were hearing wasn't a press statement. It was a perspective.
I want people to understand something,
Shaq said, turning now slightly so he wasn't facing the cameras directly, but the people behind them. What happened to me today isn't rare. It's just recorded. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. I'm not here because it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I'm here because it's the most recent version of something that happens every day to people without cameras watching. And if my name or my face can make it visible, then so be it. His voice lowered, not in volume, but in tone. I didn't speak out inside the museum because I wanted to see how far the moment would go without interference. Not out of ego, but out of curiosity. How deep does the bias run when it's left unchecked? Another step forward. I learned something. I learned that dignity doesn't need defending. It just needs presence. And sometimes the loudest way to protest is to not move. Behind the press cluster, a college student began live streaming. Her hand trembled slightly, but her focus was sharp. In the comments section, flames, hearts, yesers, and a flood of quotes already being pulled and paraphrased. Shaq continued. I'm not here to drag a guard. I'm not here to shame a policy. I'm here to ask a question. If a man who's been on TV for 30 years can be mistaken for a threat in a justice museum, what happens to the ones who aren't famous? The crowd shifted again. Quiet. Still. Holding the weight. I'm not the story, he said. The story is how we decide who belongs. Who gets grace. Who gets suspicion. The story is the silent math people do when someone walks into a room and doesn't fit their picture of who should be there. He let the words sit, then added one final line. And the only way to change that picture is to stay in the frame. He stepped back then, not retreating, just done. The reporters shouted more questions, but he didn't respond. He nodded once, turned, and began walking back toward the museum. No entourage. No security. Just a 7-foot man moving through sunlight, leaving the weight of assumption behind him. Inside, Nolan Jeffries stared at the monitors, stunned. The PR drafts in his folder, none of them usable now. Not next to that. On the far side of the atrium, Brandon McCree stood in the staff corridor, arms folded. He'd watched the entire broadcast. He hadn't spoken to anyone since being pulled off the floor. But in his chest, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar had settled. Not shame, not yet, but the early stirrings of confrontation, of self, of system, of silence. Elise stood alone near the entrance, not moving. Her phone buzzed with notifications, but she didn't check them. She didn't need to. She had just seen something more honest than any policy document she'd ever signed. Outside, the news feeds lit up. Shaq speaks with grace after being profiled in Civil Rights Museum. Stay in the fray. Shaq's response to discrimination goes viral. And beneath it all, the clip of his speech spread. Not because it was scandalous, but because it wasn't. It was measured. It was still. And it was undeniable. Because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do in the face of injustice is to show up, speak truth, and walk away unbothered. At the head of the table sat Arnold Partridge, chairman of the board, and a man whose silver hair, manicured hands, and cufflinks bearing the museum's emblem signaled control, as much as vanity. To his left, Lydia Voss, lead donor liaison, brows furrowed as she scanned her third tablet screen. To his right, Carl Hewitt, legal counsel, lips pursed like he was already mid-deposition. The rest of the board members formed a silent semicircle of reputation managers in suits. And at the far end, nearly opposite Arnold, sat Elise Morrow, hair pulled back in a low twist, blazer reworn from the day before, and the weight of 1,000 tweets, in one viral moment hanging from her shoulders. Beside her, an empty chair. Brandon McCree had been asked not to attend. Arnold cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said, not inviting but instructing. "We've all seen the footage. We've all read the headlines. I'd like to open with a direct inquiry. Elise, why was Mr. O'Neill inside a restricted exhibit, without staff escort or clearance?" Elise didn't blink. "Because he walked in." Arnold's jaw clenched. "That's not procedure." "No," Elise said, "but neither is racial profiling." The words hit like a dropped folder in a courtroom. A few board members exchanged looks. Carl adjusted his glasses. "We're not here to assign blame." "Yes, we are," Elise cut in. "We just don't want to admit it." Lydia leaned forward, tone gentle but layered. "Elise, you've been a champion for public access, for expansion. No one's questioning your intentions, but we need to be realistic about optics." "I'm not concerned about optics," Elise said, voice steady. "I'm concerned about accountability." Arnold steepled his fingers. Accountability for what? Exactly. A security guard following protocol. A VIP guest entering a staff-controlled exhibit without notifying anyone. Elise exhaled, slow and sharp. She opened the folder on the table in front of her, slid out a thin stack of papers, and passed them down the table. "These are internal incident reports filed by Brandon McCree over the last 6 months. 18 total. 14 of them involved visitors who were people of color. 11 of those were false alarms. No infractions, no disruptions, no breaches, just suspicion." Arnold scanned the top sheet, face unreadable. "This didn't begin with Shaq," Elise continued. "It's just the first time someone noticed. The first time someone famous noticed." Carl cleared his throat. "Have these reports been independently verified?" "They're system logs," Elise replied. "Timestamped, digitally archived. We've ignored a pattern because the damage didn't go public until now." Silence fell again, denser now. One board member, Elliot James, an older man with a sharp jaw and a history in corporate branding, leaned forward. "And what do you propose we do?" he asked. "Apologize? Suspend the guard? Install scanners that can read intent?" His tone was cynical, but not cruel, more tired than anything. Elise didn't flinch. "Brandon's already been suspended. But that's not enough. This isn't just about one man's instincts. It's about a culture that says suspicion is safer than inclusion." Arnold's fingers tapped against the table once. "What you're suggesting could open us up to litigation, donor withdrawal, press scrutiny. It could also open us up to progress," Elise replied. "And credibility." Lydia looked over her glasses. "You're suggesting we take the heat instead of deflecting it." "I'm suggesting we own the moment," Elise said. Because we ask people every day to walk into this building and believe we stand for justice. If we can't admit when we've failed that mission, then all we've built is a well-decorated lie. Another pause. It stretched long. Finally, Arnold leaned back, arms crossed. And the exhibit? The portrait of Mr. O'Neill? Elise inhaled. We unveil it, publicly, with context, with transparency, and with an expansion. Shaq's requested names we've missed. Names of quiet changemakers, mentors, workers, organizers. He wants this space to reflect the reality of justice, not just the myth. Arnold raised a brow. He's curating now? He's participating, Elise said. And after what we asked him to endure, the least we can do is listen. Carl spoke again. What about the donors? I'll talk to them, Elise replied. You think you can keep them calm? I don't care if they're calm, Elise said. I care if they stay, and the only way they will is if they see integrity in action. The room absorbed her words slowly. Elliot looked around, then spoke quietly. The press is watching us now. The internet too. This isn't just a one-day storm. If we try to pivot, we look spineless. If we dig in, we look defensive. She's right. We need to lean into the truth. Arnold's eyes narrowed, not in disagreement, but in calculation. And you're willing to be the face of this correction, Elise? She met his gaze evenly. I already am. For a moment, nothing moved.
Then Arnold nodded once.
Prepare a statement. Not from the PR department. From you. A personal address. Tie it to the exhibit relaunch. We'll vote on the expanded honoree list after final review. He looked around the table. No objections came. Elise, he said, voice lower now. If this goes wrong, it won't, she replied, rising from her seat. Because it already went right. She gathered her folder, smoothed her jacket, and left the boardroom without another word. Behind her, the museum's most powerful voices sat stunned, partly by the shift they hadn't seen coming, and partly by the woman who had stopped asking for permission to lead. Outside the conference room, the corridor was quiet, but not for long. Because change had been invited in, and it wasn't leaving politely. Beside him walked Lucille O'Neill, wrapped in a long cream-colored coat, sunglasses resting atop her head, her hand looped casually through her son's thick arm. She walked slow, steady, eyes absorbing everything with a quiet authority earned long before the world knew his name. The staff recognized her, of course, not from celebrity, from posture, from presence, from the kind of grace that didn't need introduction. They were met at the entrance by Elise Morrow. Her stance was firm, composed, but today it held something else too, relief. She offered a warm, brief nod and guided them past the lobby, bypassing the usual exhibition path and heading straight toward the locked wing. There were no velvet ropes this time, no warnings, no guards at attention. The hall was empty, yet full, with history, with memory, with an unspoken anticipation. Shaq said nothing on the walk. Lucille glanced at him once, curious but patient. She knew this visit wasn't about public vindication. It was personal. Something unfinished had been calling to him, and today was the answer. The door to the locked wing opened with a soft mechanical sigh. Shaq stepped through first. Lucille followed, her heels echoing faintly on the polished floor. The lighting was soft, warmer than before. The portraits along the curved wall had been rearranged, expanded. 7 had become 11. And at the far end of the gallery, a space had been cleared. A wide, clean portion of wall stood empty, lit from above, a brass plaque already affixed beneath it. Lucille tilted her head.
Where's your portrait? She asked gently.
Shaq looked toward Elise, who stepped forward and answered with calm clarity. He asked us to hold off. Lucille blinked. Why? Shaq stepped toward the wall. The plaque at the base gleamed, already engraved. Shaquille R. O'Neal. Legacy in motion, advocate, educator, humanitarian, to be revealed. He placed his hand gently against the bare wall, then turned back toward his mother. Because it didn't feel finished, he said. Lucille looked to Elise. The two women shared a glance. Then Elise gestured subtly toward the other end of the room. Come see. They walked slowly down the line. One by one, the new portraits came into view. Clara Jennings, a former bus driver in Tallahassee, who used her home to shelter young activists during the 1960s, her identity protected for decades. Devin D. Miles, a teacher from Memphis whose after-school writing program led to over 50 first-generation college graduates. many of whom now work in law and public service. Ruth Caldwell, a nurse who ran an underground medical network during the peak of police crackdowns in Chicago, treating protest injuries in silence. And Emery James, a sanitation worker who organized union strikes not for better pay, but for protective gear after 3 of his coworkers died in unsafe conditions. Lucille stopped in front of each one, reading the plaques slowly. Her eyes softened. She touched her hand to her chest. "These names," she said. "These people, no one ever talked about them." Shaq nodded. "I found them in a binder, at the back of the archive room. Obituaries, letters, unpublished papers. No fanfare, just impact." He turned to Elise. "I told her I wouldn't let my story take up space until theirs did too." Elise nodded once, the kind of nod that came from both agreement and deep respect. "We researched every lead," she said. "Confirmed the stories, verified through community records, oral histories, and we honored their families. All of them signed off. Their legacies now live here." Lucille stepped closer to her son. "You could have had your portrait hanging already," she said. "Your name, your face." Shaq looked at her and smiled. "Mama, they made me a legend for throwing a ball through a hoop. These folks changed lives and never got clapped for once." Lucille looked back at the wall. Her voice quieted. "And now, they will." The 3 of them stood still. Not for show, not for a photo, just to be present in the history they had collectively lifted. The air in the room felt different now. No longer unfinished, just honest. Elise turned slightly, speaking to both of them. "We'll unveil your portrait when you're ready. But I think you already made your statement." Shaq nodded. "We'll do it when the schools start touring this wing. When the kids can walk through and see these names and ask who's that, and learn something real." He looked to his mother. "I want that to be the moment." Lucille smiled, tears resting at the edges of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Fulfillment. Pride. "Then it'll be right," she said. "Not just yours. Theirs too." And that was legacy. Not framed, not frozen, but chosen. The chatter of 4th graders bounced softly through the museum's main corridor, backpacks shifting, sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, hands pointing at exhibits, questions flying out faster than answers could be given. It was a Tuesday morning, a field trip day, the kind of visit that museum guides knew to pace with a mix of patience and practiced storytelling. Today's group came from Burke Elementary. 22 kids in matching maroon sweatshirts that read "Future Leaders in Training." Their teacher, Ms. Harmon, a woman with curly hair tucked into a loose bun and reading glasses perpetually sliding down her nose, walked with quiet authority at the front of the line. She wasn't new to this museum, but this time felt different. She could feel it even before the tour began. Something in the walls, in the air. The place had changed, and not just cosmetically. They entered the first exhibit, Voices of Liberty, where students paused to touch interactive screens, pressing buttons to hear audio clips from civil rights speeches. A few boys lingered at the Rosa Parks installation, reading the tiny print beneath a preserved bus seat. Girls gathered around the photographs of student protesters, marveling at how young they were. It was the kind of learning that didn't require grading, just presence. But the real moment came later. Ms. Harmon led them into the West Wing, through a freshly renovated hallway lined with quotes etched into the stone. One in particular caught a boy's eye, a short line above the archway into the gallery. "Justice isn't a space, it's how we treat each other inside it." He slowed his pace. "Ms. Harmon," he asked, pointing up. "What's that mean?" She smiled, walked back to him, crouched just enough to meet his eye level. "It means justice isn't about fancy rooms or velvet ropes. It's not just about laws and speeches either. It's about choices.
Everyday ones.
How we look at each other, how we speak up, who we make feel like they belong." The boy's brow crinkled. "Is this where that basketball guy got kicked out?" Some of the other students paused. Ms. Harmon didn't flinch. "It's the place where he taught a lot of people to see." The boy looked thoughtful. "Did he get mad?" "No," she said. "He got still." They walked in. The space was different now. Where once there had been division barriers marked with protocol and silence, there was now an expanded gallery called Legacy in Motion. The wall of portraits curved longer than before. Each face bore not just fame but story. Not just recognition, but resolve. The students walked in small groups, eyes bouncing from one image to the next. They stood quietly in front of the portrait of Clara Jennings, reading about the bus driver who became a protector. They tilted their heads at the oil painting of Emery James, the sanitation worker turned Union legend. Some even stopped to admire Devon Miles, his portrait painted beside a chalkboard, where faded math equations blended into poetry on the wall behind him. But the largest gap in the exhibit sat at the far right wall. A brass plate read, Shaquille O'Neal. To be revealed. One boy squinted. Where's his picture? A guide nearby smiled. He asked us to wait. Why? Because he wanted others to be seen first. The boy said nothing after that. He just stared at the plaque for a long time, then slowly rejoined his group. From behind a narrow museum office window, Elise Morrow watched the class move through the wing. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. There were still meetings, still donors to update, still forms and public schedules. But today she let herself pause, let herself feel something more than duty. She watched the children wander through stories she helped uncover, through lives that had been nearly forgotten, and now stood tall under museum lights. Outside, the sunlight bathed the courtyard in gold. There, half hidden by the low shadows of a memorial statue, sat a familiar figure on a bench. No cameras, no fanfare, just Shaquille O'Neal, in a navy hoodie and jeans, his shoulders relaxed, head tilted back as he soaked in the sun like it was permission to be invisible again. He didn't need to go inside today. He knew the space was fuller now. Not perfect, not finished, but fuller. A group of passing students exited through the main doors, filing into a waiting yellow bus. One girl waved at him as she walked past, not because she knew who he was, but because she sensed something kind in him. He nodded once. Lucille had asked him earlier that week if he was ready for his portrait to be unveiled. Not yet, he'd said. Let the names breathe. Let the silence teach. Let the moment grow legs before it's framed in glass. From across the street, a man took a photo of the museum. Shaq wasn't in frame. Not fully. Just the edge of his shoe. The curve of the bench. And that was enough. Because not all legacies require center stage. Some just need one step beyond the rope. And in that quiet, sun-warmed moment, without applause or headlines, Shaq faded back into the world. Not erased, but absorbed. Legacy, after all, isn't about the portrait. It's about the space you make for others before it's your turn to be seen. Next time you walk into a space that honors history, ask yourself who's missing. Legacy isn't what we hang on walls. It's what we choose to see in the everyday. Justice doesn't begin with outrage. It begins with presence. Stay awake. Stay in the room. Because the story isn't over, and neither is your part in it.